Hello, and welcome to the second part of my review for Joker Pretentious French Subtitle. If you haven't seen part 1 of this review, then I highly recommend you watch it before you watch this video, and much like with part 1, there will be heavy spoilers in this video, so please keep that in mind as we go along. With all that said, let us go back to where we left off. As I mentioned before, this movie introduces the idea that Arthur Fleck and the Joker are not the same thing, which on paper could be an interesting idea. There could be a lot of different ways this idea could be interestingly executed. Unfortunately, it doesn't end up working because, again, for most of the movie, you see Arthur Fleck. You don't see the Joker at all. And so it just kind of makes this whole thing more underwhelming. If you had equal parts the Joker and Arthur Fleck throughout the movie, then this would be fine. But most of the movie is just Arthur Fleck. Again, you don't make a movie about how Arthur Fleck became the Joker and then have the sequel just be entirely Arthur Fleck, with the Joker very rarely appearing in the movie. Most of the time when you see the Joker in this movie, it's in a fantasy sequence musical number. I think there's only like one scene. There's one trial scene where you see like the Joker in the real world, and then in the rest of his appearances, they're in like a fantasy sequence. And so that ends up making this idea underwhelming. In the latter half of the movie, there's a scene where a bunch of prison guards assault Arthur Fleck. There's a different word that I could use for this, but I don't want to say it because I don't want to risk getting demonetized. It's not shown in the movie, but it is heavily implied, and I guess this is what convinces Arthur to just admit that the Joker doesn't exist. In the following trial, Arthur admits there is no Joker. It was Arthur Fleck and not the Joker that shot Murray Franklin. It was Arthur Fleck and not the Joker that murdered those 3 guys on the subway in the first movie. Most of the movie just portrays Arthur as this sad, pathetic loser. I've seen a lot of people speculate that this was done in response to the incel "we live in a society" weirdos that loved the first movie for the wrong reasons, that looked up to Arthur Fleck for the wrong reasons. The problem is, with how the movie executes this idea, it ends up insulting anyone that loved the first movie, even like normal people that acknowledged Arthur Fleck was not a good person. Shortly after that, Arthur meets up with Harley Quinn in the iconic Joker stairs from the first movie, and Harley ends up leaving Arthur because she doesn't care about Arthur Fleck. She wanted to be with the Joker, and now that Arthur had essentially retired the Joker and admitted that he regrets it, kind of, she doesn't want to be with Arthur anymore, which again could be an interesting idea, except for the fact that, again, Lady Gaga barely appears in the movie. She barely does anything. Her character barely does anything in the entire movie. You barely see these two interact with each other in the movie, and most of their interactions are, again, in the in musical sequences, the fantasy sequences, whatever. Most of the musical numbers are in these fantasy sequences, and those are like the only times where it's like you see the Joker in the movie and not Arthur Fleck. Those are the only times where you see Arthur Fleck or the Joker or whatever interacting with Harley Quinn. They barely do anything together in the real world. And so once again, this potentially interesting idea ends up feeling very underwhelming. Now, with the exception of Arthur getting assaulted by the security guards, seriously, there is no way to justify or fix that scene. The only way you could fix that scene is if you removed it from the movie. But besides that, the other ideas I've brought up, they have the potential to work. The idea that like Arthur Fleck and the Joker are not the same person. The idea that like Arthur Fleck regrets the Joker and he acknowledges that like there was never a Joker. It was him that did all the terrible things. The response to the incel "we live in a society" fans of the first movie that looked up to Arthur Fleck as this hero, even though he was not supposed to be someone to look up to. The idea that Harley Quinn wanted to be with the Joker and not Arthur Fleck, and that's why she left Arthur. All of that could be potentially interesting. Here is the problem. Barely anything happens in this movie, and so it ends up coming off as just underwhelming, a lot of these ideas. If there was stuff that happened in this movie, these ideas could be a lot better. You could very easily have a Bonnie and Clyde-esque story with the Joker and Harley Quinn, and also have that tie into the whole idea that, like, Arthur Fleck eventually ends up regretting the Joker stuff. He ends up regretting what he started, and that's what causes him to admit there was no Joker. It was Arthur Fleck that did everything. And then that also ties into the idea that, like, Harley Quinn doesn't want to be with Arthur Fleck, she wants to be with the Joker. You can have that and also give the fans what they wanted, a Bonnie and Clyde-esque crime story with the Joker and Harley Quinn. You can have both in the movie. It's possible, I promise y'all. You know how at the end of the first movie, you had all of these people that looked up to Arthur as this hero of some sort? You had all these rioters and protesters that looked up to him as a hero? Yeah, that's barely explored in this second movie. And I feel like if this was a bigger part of the second movie, this could have had the whole thing of, like, we don't want to be associated with the incel fans of the first movie. That whole thing could have worked a lot better. You could have Arthur Fleck see the cult following that he has garnered, and that ends up causing him to regret what he started with the Joker. It would also make it a lot easier for the movie to acknowledge that, yes, we're specifically targeting the incel fans of the first movie. Those that are normal and liked the first movie and acknowledge that Arthur Fleck was not a hero of any kind, they're not being targeted by this. It's the incel, we live in a society people that we're making fun of here. A lot of the ideas that are in this movie, they can stay, but it would also be helped if stuff actually happened in this movie, instead of just having it go back and forth between a fantasy sequence musical number and a courtroom scene. With how the final movie turned out, it doesn't feel like an insult to the incel we live in a society fans of the first movie. It feels like an insult to anyone that liked the first movie. It's honestly kind of ironic that this movie is so ashamed of the first movie, and yet half of the movie is just them recapping the stuff that happened in the first movie, without adding anything new to the table. They add nothing new to the whole thing of, like, the Joker shot Murray Franklin, the Joker murdered the 3 guys on the subway. They add nothing new to that. It's just repeating what happened in the first movie without adding anything new to it. And as I brought up before, there is important stuff from the first movie, seemingly important stuff that's just never acknowledged once in this sequel. There's an entire character that was important to the first movie that they don't even say his name even once in this second movie. The rioters and protesters from the first movie, they don't get acknowledged at all. The closest this movie gets to showcasing the devoted fan base Arthur Fleck and the Joker and whatever garnered at the end of the first movie, the closest the movie gets to calling out the incel fans of the first movie is in the final trial scene, where the jury is finding Arthur guilty for everything that he did in the first movie. And then while this is happening, an explosion is set off behind Arthur. And I just want to say, I can't show it for obvious reasons, but the explosion looks absolutely terrible. I don't know if it's like the explosion itself or it's like the way the camera shakes, if that makes sense. It's really hard to tell you this without showing you what it looks like visually, but something about it looks really off. And remember, this movie had a $200 million budget, so it makes even less sense as to why it looks bad. But anyways, an explosion is set off, and then these 2 people, they kidnap Arthur, I guess, and, like, they drive away. They're trying to drive away out of Gotham City with Arthur, I guess, to just, like, you know, start a new life in a city. I have no idea. And then while this is happening, Arthur gets up and leaves the car, and then that's it. That's the only time you ever really see, like, the devoted fan base that Arthur had garnered in the first movie. That's the closest the movie gets to criticizing the incel fans of the first movie. Besides that, the movie just feels ashamed of the first movie. Like, it's trying its hardest to disassociate itself from the first movie, which again, is really hard for it to do, because most of the movie is just them reciting what happened in the first movie. movie. There's one scene in the movie where they actually add on to something that happened in the first movie. There's one actually good scene in this movie, one of the courtroom trial scenes that I thought was actually pretty good. In the first movie, shortly before Arthur leaves to the Murray Franklin show, he's visited by two former co-workers, Randall and Gary. Early into the first movie, Randall gives Arthur a gun, and then while Arthur is performing at a children's hospital, the gun accidentally slides out, and this causes him to be fired from his job, and further escalates his descent into becoming the Joker. As a result of this, Arthur ends up murdering Randall. However, he decides to let Gary go unharmed. And so in this movie, there's a scene where Gary is brought up as one of the witnesses in court. And for once, the movie actually adds new information into what happened in the first movie. Gary revealed that ever since that incident, he's been scared for his life. He's had numerous sleepless nights, worried that Arthur will find him and murder him. And it's actually a pretty powerful scene. It's like the only good scene in the entire movie. And it shows that you can acknowledge what happened in the first movie and actually add like new information to it instead of just recapping what happened in the first movie for no other reason other than just because. But no, remember, we're ashamed of the first movie. We want to distance ourselves away from the first movie because of a minority of people that liked it for the wrong reasons, in which the criticism towards that minority of people was very poorly executed, and so it instead comes off like the movie is criticizing anyone that liked the first movie. The biggest kicker to all of this, though, is the ending. Probably one of the most controversial movie endings in recent history. And even though it's extremely early for me to say this, I think this could go down as one of the most controversial endings in movie history. Joker 1's ending was iconic for the right reasons. Joker 2's ending is iconic for the wrong reasons. Occasionally throughout this movie, there is this inmate who doesn't really have much importance to the movie, but they do show him from time to time to make you think that like, yeah, this is gonna build up to something. He's gonna be important at some point. And so near the end of this movie, as Arthur is walking somewhere, this guy goes up to Arthur and tells him a joke, and the joke ends up culminating with him stabbing Arthur to death. And as the camera zooms into Arthur Fleck dying, you could see in the background this guy cutting his mouth with the knife, implying that he becomes Heath Ledger's Joker, which honestly kind of makes both of these movies pointless now in retrospect. It just opens up a lot more questions, and it's never going to answer any of them. Does this mean that Joaquin Phoenix's Joker is not actually the real Joker, and instead he was just the guy who inspired the real Joker? Or does this mean that Heath Ledger's Joker is not the real Joker, and instead he's just some guy who was inspired by Joaquin Phoenix's Joker? Like, it makes no sense. It really makes no sense at all. I'm guessing the movie is trying to convey that, like, anyone could be the Joker. There doesn't have to be one Joker, but, like, I don't know. It's like, it's so poorly done and confusing. Oh yeah, I figured this might be relevant to bring up. Apparently the first Joker was gonna end with Joaquin Phoenix's version of the character carving a smile into his mouth just like Heath Ledger's version. But then Christopher Nolan, who was with Warner Bros. At the time, rejected the idea, believing that Heath Ledger's version was the only version allowed to do that. And so now that Christopher Nolan is no longer at Warner Bros., the people behind this movie decided, okay, we could put it into this movie now. He's not going to do anything about it. He can't do anything about it. So, you know, that just to make things even better. At the same time, I can ever so slightly see where they're coming from with this whole idea that, like, Arthur Fleck, Joaquin Phoenix, whatever, is not the real Joker. In the first movie, we see Bruce Wayne, who we all know as Batman, but it has him as a kid. And so in this universe, this would mean that like when Bruce Wayne grows up and becomes Batman, that would make Arthur Fleck basically like a really old man, an elderly man. And so it doesn't really line up perfectly. And so then you have this younger guy becoming the real Joker, Heath Ledger's Joker potentially. And so I guess it kind of lines up more with the timeline in a way. I don't know. Even then, I'm pretty sure this other guy would still be too old to be like the actual Joker by the time Bruce Wayne becomes Batman. Remember, there's only a 2-year time skip between the first movie and the second movie. This would also make Lady Gaga's Harley Quinn too old to fight the Batman in this universe, and it's never implied that like there's someone else who becomes the next Harley Quinn after Lady Gaga. And so it opens up more questions and answers, and it's so confusing, seriously. Maybe I'm overthinking this stuff, but I have no idea. Part of what made the first Joker so good was that it was its own thing. It was its own take on this character. It wasn't attached to any universe. It wasn't attached to the then ongoing DCEU. It wasn't part of the Dark Knight universe. It wasn't part of the Michael Keaton, Tim Burton Batman universe. Years later, it would be announced that this movie doesn't take place in the same universe as the Robert Pattinson Batman universe. It's its own thing. It's not connected to any cinematic universe. It's not connected to anything like that. It's its own standalone thing. And so when you have an ending like this, vaguely implying that you're tying it to another Batman universe, it just opens up more questions and it answers none of them. And then it just really makes you question, why did they make this movie in the first place? The first movie worked perfectly as a one-time standalone film, and that's it. This movie not only undoes everything that was established in the first movie, but it also just makes the timeline so much more confusing. Why did they make this movie, honestly? Why did they make it? Well, actually, I know the reason why. There's one reason that they made this movie, and one reason only. The first Joker was originally announced to be a standalone one-time movie, and that was it. But then something happened that made them change their minds. Wink, wink. Director Todd Phillips has announced that he doesn't plan to make a third Joker movie. He doesn't plan to make a spin-off movie focusing on Lady Gaga's Harley Quinn. His time with DC was just these 2 movies, and that's it. It's going to leave all of these questions completely unanswered, but at least that means the first movie won't be further ruined. It's one thing to have a great movie with a bad sequel, but when you have a trilogy that has 1 great movie and 2 bad sequels, it's a whole nother story. I mean, just look at the other big movie that Todd Phillips is known for, The Hangover. The first movie in 2009 was largely successful, but then the sequels from 2011 and 2013 were a lot more poorly received in comparison. Between Hangover 2 and 3 and Joker 2, I think it's safe to say that Todd Phillips isn't exactly the best when it comes to making sequels. And yes, it might seem very hard to believe, but it is indeed true. The Hangover and Joker were both made by the same person. Quite the filmography Todd Phillips has, I must say. Quite the filmography.